So this is just a very brief introduction where I want to share what was a light bulb moment for me in terms of understanding, how one could combine stories and data together in order to get some new insights. By way of background, I'm one of the co-organizers of this group. My day job is a digital and database consultant, and I work with charities that deliver complex services. And as a side project, I've got, over the last few years, I've got interested in complexity thinking, and specifically the Cynefin framework, which we'll maybe touch on today, but only very briefly. And as part of that, I came across the Sensemaker product, which is what we're looking at today. So as a starting point, and this is sort of 101 stuff, but in crude terms, one could say that data is very good for understanding that you've got a problem, but maybe not so good in terms of understanding the underlying causes, or in terms of helping you decide what actions you might take to improve matters. And as I think there's been quite a lot of work done around the fact that when you're gathering data, it can often be subject to the biases of the data gatherer in terms of the way that you frame questions, or indeed the questions that you never ask. On the other hand, stories do give you that much richer picture, and have the advantage that they're under the control of the storyteller. The storyteller chooses what it is they're going to tell you, and potentially can address some of the weaknesses that I touched on in relation to data around understanding and causes, and helping find solutions. But typically, traditionally, the problem with stories is you can only typically collect them in small volumes, so they can be seen as anecdotal rather than evidence, and it can be difficult to identify themes and patterns from those. So in theory, if you can combine stories with data and capture at scale, it gives you the best of both worlds. And in particular, and the reason I suppose for my interest is that it delivers the ability to work with, I've just realized, we didn't do the poll, did we? Kate?
I can do the poll now. Okay,
so as I'm talking, the questions are on the next slide. It delivers the ability to sort of work with, quote, complex problems. So it's on the slide after this. So the question then comes, what is a complex problem? And there are a whole variety of different definitions. I've just picked two here that I think are useful. One is problems where there's rich interconnectivity or meshing entanglement. And you're trying to solve the problem. There are lots of different components, and they're all interlinked in ways that are not necessarily clear. And they cover a whole range of issues, things like weather, economic systems, biological systems, but typically anything involving people is typically a complex problem. To help you sort of just think a bit about that, what I'd like you to do is, and the questions are at the bottom there, Kate.
I did the poll already, so it's ready to go.
Okay, so basically I'd like you to think of a recent challenging project that's either nearing completion or which is complete. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you two lists. One describing ordered problems and the other describing complex problems. And in looking at those lists, I'd like you to think about where on the spectrum of those five options your particular project fits. Was it largely ordered? Was it some combination of the two, or was it largely complex? So if I show you this slide, I'm not going to read it out because there are lots of characteristics on here. And quite often projects will be a mixture of the two. But if you run your eye down each of those lists, think about your project, and then if Kate can put up the questionnaire shortly, then we can get some idea of whether the project that you're thinking about falls more in the ordered category or more in the complex category.
I'll let people have a read first.
Yeah.
Okay, I've launched the poll. I think the other co-hosts won't be able to vote. Give people a few more seconds. Last chance, and I'll close it. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now, and then I'll share the results so you'll see them, Richard.
Thanks. But I think, yeah, I mean, what's interesting is that most of you, I mean, I'm not totally surprised by that, but most of you are working with problems that are, you know, more complex than ordered. So moving on, if I can get back to my, so how do stories combined with data help with complex problems? And as I've already said, there are a large number of different ways of working with complexity. And this is one particular approach, which in its simplest form can be summed up by, you know, where are we now and what can we easily change? And what I want to do is share this particular study that, if I can get rid of, which was basically something that I heard about a good few years ago, but was a real light bulb moment for me, both in understanding how the Sensemaker tool could help, but also what it meant, the approach I've just described, what that meant in terms of how one might work with complexity. And what this was a study with nurses in which the nurses were asked, and I'm probably mangling the original case study here, but something along the line, tell me a story about looking after a patient. And the way Sensemaker works is that you capture the story and then you set it up to ask a series of questions about the story. And two of the questions in this particular what they call collector were, in this story, to what extent was the outcome, did you feel the outcome was satisfactory for the patient? And in this story, to what extent were you able to follow the procedures? And what they found when they plotted the stories onto those two axes, onto those two dimensions, that they got a map that looked a bit like this. As I say, they got a lot more data than this. I've really simplified this, but what we had was in the top right-hand corner, oops, sorry, go back. In the top right-hand corner, we had a bunch of stories where procedures had been followed and the nurse felt the outcome had been good for the patient. And when they looked at those stories and the data, other data associated with them, what they found was that those were predominantly in operating theatres, which is, you know, good news for anybody that's got some sort of procedure coming up. And then they found a bunch of stories down in the bottom right-hand corner where basically the nurse felt that they had delivered a good outcome for the patient, but they hadn't followed all the procedures. And then more worryingly, there are a bunch of stories in the bottom left-hand corner where they'd neither followed the procedures and the nurse felt that they hadn't been able to deliver a satisfactory outcome for the patient. And then there are a small number of stories in the middle. And what I realized from this is that one of the phrases that Dave Snowden, who's the guy that originated a lot of these techniques, he talks about how do we get more stories like this and fewer like that. And what this map gives you is a tool for understanding both why the problems are occurring. If you look at those stories in the bottom left-hand corner, and you can start to think, okay, how can we address some of the problems that those stories are describing? But it also gives you how can we get more stories like the stories in the top right-hand corner, and more importantly, those small number of stories in the middle. And one of the key things about working with complex problems is this idea of identifying weak signals. You know, small bits of fragments of information that can help you, guide you in terms of your immediate next steps. Those stories potentially give you some indication of how you might improve matters. And one of the key things about complex systems is what's called their dispositionality, which means you can move them more easily in one direction than you can in another. We've all been in situations where we've been trying to bring about some sort of change and you've hit a brick wall. And sometimes you find that the best way to get around that brick wall is to sort of navigate to the side. And this is a good illustration of how, if you're going straight up from that bottom right-hand corner is unlikely to work. But by sort of moving towards those stories in the center, they give you clues as how you can maybe navigate round that potential brick wall. So that was my light bulb moment. And hopefully that was helpful in terms of introducing what Beth has gone on to. So just to emphasize, we're looking at one possible approach to combining stories and data today. Other approaches are available. And two that we're aware of are a piece of work that's been done at the old Oxford Fire Station that I'll put a link to in our resources document to, and also a piece of software called Polis that I recently came across, which uses sort of AI techniques to analyze sort of story data. There are almost certainly other techniques. If you're aware of any, can you either put them in the chat or add to our meeting document? So we're going to be looking at this tool called Sensemaker. What would be useful is just to get some idea of how many of you have heard of that before. It's from a company called the Cynefin Company, and there's a framework called the Cynefin Framework that's associated with it. How many of you have some awareness of Sensemaker and Cynefin? If you could put your hands up either on screen or by using the...
I can see a couple of hands.
Yeah, that's okay. That's useful to know. So most of you are sort of relatively new to this. Sensemaker has been around, I mean, Beth can say for how long, but it's been around for a long time and is used in a wide variety of complex contexts. I won't read those out, but it gives you a flavor of the different areas where it has and is being used. So what I'd like to do now is introduce Beth, who is program manager at the Cynefin Company, focusing on community engagement. We would like to try and make this as interactive as possible. So if you've got questions or if you've not understood something, please put it in the chat and we will periodically stop the session and go through those questions so that we can hopefully keep everybody on board. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
This will be kind of dipping our toes into things. And if anybody wants to geek out with me around statistics, then maybe we could find another time to do that. But I'll just talk around some basic structures and examples for today. Okay, so I'm Beth. I'm the program manager for citizen engagement and democratic innovation. But in a previous life, I actually worked as a monitoring and evaluation officer at a county voluntary council. So I'm kind of closely associated with a lot of the work I imagine you guys are doing. So a lot of understanding for that. The Cynefin framework, so this is what we call the Cynefin framework for dummies, just recognizes that there are kind of 4 fundamental different types of system that exist within the world. So if we start with the obvious domain, so you might see it referred to as simple. This is the kind of system or environment whereby we know all of the variables that exist within it. So we can map and measure against them and we can do best practice. It's the kind of situation or scenario whereby there's a really clear set of rules and structures on how you do things. There's let's say a menu, not a menu, a recipe for cooking a cake, and if you follow the recipe, every time you're going to get the same cake. And then when we look at the complicated kind of domain, we might think about this as sending a rocket ship to the moon. It's no easy feat. It requires a lot of expertise and knowledge, but with the right people and the right systems and analytics in place, you can do that successfully, and you can largely manage for all of the variables, but they might not necessarily be apparent to the average person on the street. The complex domain, which is where we're really interested in, is where we've always going to be working with incomplete or impartial data sets. or we never quite know all of the variables that happen within a system. So if you think of that as almost like the ecosystem, that there's so many things that are interacting and intertwined, or a ball of wool even, if you pull on one thread, the likelihood is somewhere in amongst it, there's going to be kind of tangling happening, or you're going to be pulling on a different part of a system. The chaotic domain is largely, it happens in kind of crises and is fairly short-lived. So if we imagine the first few days after the pandemic was announced and everybody was in a state of, oh my gosh, what on earth is happening? But very quickly that becomes stabilized as we start adding kind of variables, rules and constraints to a system. So on the basis of there being these 4 different types of system that exist, in terms of understanding each of these types of systems, we use different methods and different techniques in order to do them the most justice. So I'm largely going to be talking about complex domain today. And in particular, citizen participation or community participation in understanding a complex situation. Because we recognize in a complex domain that no one person is the expert in it, in that we might all be plugged into a system, but we're all seeing and feeling different outcomes from it. So, when we recognize the role of involving people, we can use that to build community, to build democratic legitimacy, to improve transparency and establish new ways of doing things, and to actually, collectively work together to make everything a little bit better, and hopefully do that in a way that allows people to feel a sense of belonging in doing that. So traditionally, whenever monitoring and evaluation in particular, it's always something that's been done to people. It's very much an extractive exercise, in that, a monitoring evaluation officer or a research kind of comes along, treats people a bit like lab rats, observes them, analyzes them, takes the data away and makes sense of it for themselves. What we're trying to say is that actually we need to build a greater sense of agency and belonging into that process. And particularly where we're working in complex environments, or where we're especially working in intercultural environments where different people might see or experience things differently. So, in recognition that we might all be, subject to the same service or kind of project, but the knock-on impact might be felt very differently for different people in amongst the system. And for us, it's about really starting to understand that, both in terms of the qualitative aspects, but actually also how we might be able to get a quantitative handle on some of these things. So as my favorite philosopher, Morticia Adams from the Addams family says, what's normal to the spider is chaos to the fly. And recognizing within a complex system, that is a pretty good metaphor for what might be going on. And the best way to work with that is to involve people and to keep making small changes, sensing for the impacts, coming back together and kind of continuing that as an iterative process. And so the way in which we try to work with that and to map and understand that with Sensemaker is by combining both stories and statistics, or kind of hearts and minds. And if I'm being particularly cynical on any one day, I might say that, it's the pulling on the stories pull on the heartstrings, the statistics pull on the purse strings. So it's actually about creating an evidence base that lots of different people can tap into and resonate with and find purpose and meaning from. And so the big thing for us is around agency being built into such data. And one way in which we do that is around the idea of interpretation. So we always start by asking people to share a story. And that story is always framed in a way that it is as broad as possible, in order to capture the diversity of opinion or experience that might exist within a system or a situation. So that is kind of how we might look out for the unknown unknowns, or the things that we might not have anticipated when we set out to do this particular thing. And then as the process goes along, we start to get a little bit more structured in the questions that we ask, and they might relate to particular KPIs or strategy or kind of systemic attributes that we actually want to start getting some really tangible data from. So the idea being that the person will share that story, and then it's the actual person who shared that story that then self-analyzes that story. So moving away from a researcher or evaluator, taking that story away, running it through NViva, whatever they might do, and especially if there might be cultural differences there. So, you know, as a white British person, if I was to read the story of somebody who was a middle-aged man in Central America, whether my interpretation of his story is necessarily valid, and some of the colonial issues that actually come with that as well. So in terms of data validity and story validity, it's far better off that the person who's had that experience is the one to define the meaning behind it. And in terms of keeping things open, it keeps us kind of keeps us aware to new possibilities that we might not have even recognized when we set out on a journey. So I'll actually show you an example of a Sensemaker, and just bear in mind that when we build a Sensemaker, you know, the questions are entirely up to the client or to work with us to define the questions. So that's not to say there is kind of any one perfect way of doing things. But this is one that's actually live at the moment. So I'll share the link with you, and this is actually open to public participation. So you can actually have a go for yourself. If my computer decides to stop freezing, I think, oh, no, I have frozen. So the particular project that I am going to show here is to get people to share a story around a meaningful interaction they've had with nature, and to start to understand people's relationship to the landscape. So when we're actually collecting Sensemaker data, it can be done through a website like this, or it can be done through a mobile phone app, which means that you can actually collect the data without access to the internet, and then upload it when you do. So we've asked people here, and we've given them the choice. Not only do they want, if they want to write a story, that they can also attach a photograph or record an audio. So in this particular instance, I'll decide to write about an experience. So, you know, I could choose to share my story about a meaningful interaction I've had with the landscape. We usually then ask people to give that story or experience a title, or possibly even a metaphor. And metaphor is a very, very interesting way of using qualitative data, because it gives us an idea of relationship. So it might not necessarily be the physical things that are happening, but it helps us understand some of the interaction that might be going on, kind of almost the between space. So you know, in my experience, my relationship to nature was like ... and get people to finish the sentence. And I'll show you some examples using that technique in a moment. We ask people then to go through, and they can code it in a really basic way. So multiple choice questions as we have here. And then what is kind of pretty unique to Sensemaker is these, what we call a triad. And it recognizes that within a system, there's lots of things that are not mutually exclusive, and that they're actually in tension with each other. And for some people, the tension might be slightly stronger one way than another. So if I'm thinking about my story, and I think actually all three of these were important, then I place the dot in the middle. And the more strongly I feel towards any one of them, kind of the closer I can move that label to represent how I feel in tension with these three things. And in doing that, we're actually generating some statistical data behind the scenes in terms of how this story is tagged. So for any data analysts out there, the fancy term for this is called spatial semiotic analysis. And it's to do with how we spatially place things in relation to certain terms or ideas. So we can see that there's kind of different tensions that we're particularly trying to scope out in this particular set of questions. And I'll give you another one here. And this is a way that we've done some things that, you know, we're using art instead of metrics to try and understand how people see themselves in constellation or in kind of systemic relationship with other people. So this is one that we quite often use in organizations to understand workplace culture. So you're at a social gathering and somebody's been offered a job at your organization. Based upon your experience working on there, what would you tell them about what it's like to work at your organization? And as the example goes here, working here is like ... So this is how we can get the metaphor data. And then we can see that we're using different sets of labels here that are more context or specific to this particular inquiry. And again, then you can see we have so what we call a dyad, so a sliding scale. But rather than being kind of good at one end and bad at the other, you'll notice we have kind of what we call the Goldilocks effect. So we'll take an idea and take it to excess on both ends. So that both ends are quite possibly negative. And it's not about evaluating whether something is good or bad. It's about getting an understanding as to what way the system is showing up. And then, as I mentioned, we've got this mechanism whereby we might get people to look at an image and see where they see themselves, where they see, I don't know, this could be my local councillor. You know, this could be, you know, my municipal government. This could be Westminster. So, you know, we can actually start to understand people's perceptions of other actors within a system. When we come to analyze the data, we can start to see where we have points of density or lots of people holding common experience or belief, which is where we can start to do some kind of cultural mapping and get some quantitative data from it. I will probably have to log back in because I'm using some bad hotel internet. And I'll try and show you kind of what comes out the other end to give you an idea of things. In the meantime, if people have any questions.
I can't see any in the chat so far, but don't be shy, people, if you've got any questions.
I've got one, which is, how do you find getting people, getting people to complete questionnaires is difficult enough under normal circumstances. Getting people to actually spend time writing out a story, I could see being even more challenging. How do you find, how easy do you find it is, how easy is it for you to get people to actually participate in this, and what techniques work?
So the big one for me is to not use this as a surveying tool. And it's to use it as a conduit for creating organic community-based conversations. So the example that I'm going to come to that we did in Wales, and again in South Sweden that we did was even bigger, was that we'd worked with young people, schools, colleges in the third sector to create kind of a network of people who were community story collectors. And it becomes more than just a data collecting activity at that point. It becomes actually, how can we encourage meaningful conversations to happen within a community or a workplace? So looking at kind of interpersonal knowledge exchange on the individual basis, but how that can then feed into a larger bank of community experience that can potentially be accessed by, you know, a broader collaboration of people. So everything we collect is timestamped, so that gives us the option to kind of have a look at things at different points in time. So we can start to see how sentiment, ideas are shifting, or, you know, we might do something before, during and after an intervention, so we can take stock of how things might be going. Another contentious topic I picked here, and only because it's open data. So this is one we did on people's thoughts around the future of the European Union. So that the general sentiments that were coming out, we can see here. We actually ran this data collection in 7 different languages simultaneously, and they're all centralized into this one data set here. So we can actually work with different language data. So we've pulled that, which is, I've set the parameters really low on this. So these are the main words that have been used. And I'll come to the main stories in a moment. And then we can see actually once a mass of people have responded to these types of questions, we can start to see where we have kind of density forming, where we have potentially kind of common beliefs or common experiences, and then kind of outliers or potentially conflicting beliefs that exist within a system. And what we can also do then is to find any of the, there's some wonderful metaphors in this one. So the European Union for me is like, and I think this really demonstrates kind of the value of using metaphor as a qualitative kind of tool.
Sorry, Beth, I've got a quick question from the chat. Rick asks, do you do anything to control for sample bias?
Yes. So this one in particular has just been done completely open data. You know, whoever picks up the link uses it. But particularly if we're using the citizen journalism technique, we can use some pretty cool mechanisms to build representative sampling into it. So as I say, with the work we did in South Wales, we had a group of interviewers, and we did some rule-based data collection. So week 1, go and interview somebody of your grandparents' generation. Week 2, interview a peer. And by doing that, we can look at the data and recognize where there might be over or under representation in the sample. And we can start to do some rule-based kind of engagement in order to kind of overcome some of that. Does that answer the question satisfactorily?
I can't see anything in the chat yet, but I'm going to take the silence as a no. Or yes, sorry, I think. No, sorry.
Wonderful. So you can see here there's a huge skew in amongst this particular cohort of people. So we can see that there's a particularly strong mandate towards democracy and vision as opposed to national autonomy. But let's say we want to look at a particular segment of the data. So I will pick, say the Netherlands, because I think they mostly speak English. So with one click of this dashboard, the whole thing is now going to become responsive to only show us the Dutch data. So we can start to look at the patterns and the themes and the sentiments that are being talked about amongst the Dutch population and start to compare possibly to the broader data set, or let's say Germany, to see whether there's any kind of particular cultural bias or, you know, whether values or sentiments differ between different parts of the overall data set. And if we'd like to say, well, show me the Dutch stories, because obviously each one of these dots actually represents a story, we can click on the little compass button down here, which I think I just clicked on twice, so it's not going to work. Yeah, I did click on it twice, so sorry, that's me being impatient with the bad internet. We can actually see each of these individual responses. So the title that the person has given it, the qualitative text that they've responded with, and let's say there's one that I might be particularly interested. This one. We can then see this particular individual case study. So what we're trying to work with here is how can we go from the individual kind of right the way out to the collective, and zoom in and out of those kind of levels and layers of scale in order to work with the data that at the level that suits us. So in the Welsh example, we had the local community and civic society working on the data set. We had the municipal government looking at it, and we had the national government looking at it. And in their own unique ways, they were all kind of interacting with this database in a slightly different way. And that the local residents and community groups were primarily invested in the stories and the local understanding, whereas the municipal governments were slightly more interested in some of the slightly more strategic type questions. And then, you know, that the national government, we were running this across 3 different communities. They were interested in the bigger kind of bird's eye view picture of what might be going on and why these communities might be totally different. So we can start to see around the individual, you know, these are the types of sentiment they hold. These are the hopes that they've got and fears that they've got. And so, as I say, this is a super, super basic way of looking at this set of data. But what we can actually start to do in the deeper parts of the platform is to start looking at statistically understanding whether there's particular skews amongst this data or belief systems, and to start looking at particularly with the qualitative data, when somebody talks about thing A, you know, what are they talking about in common with? So whenever people talk about economy, they also happen to be talking about X, Y, and Z. So we can really start to interrogate that a bit more. And I'll just go back to sharing my screen again one moment. So there's an example here where we've done one of these types of questionnaires across an organization. And we see that when operational staff are responding to this, we can map them and see that actually their point of view and what they prioritize within an organization is actually very, very different to managers. So it helps us be a little bit more kind of nuance aware, in that recognizing that in a complex environment, a one-size-fits-all approach generally doesn't work. But it's also incredibly difficult to surface these types of understandings. And so, you know, we say this is a data collection tool. For us, it's as much about having the data there to enable a conversation around the data that becomes a more kind of a socially inclusive process as well. And so how can we surface the invisible stuff so that it becomes okay to actually talk about it without feeling like it's tittle-tattle or you know, I might feel very alone in my opinion until I look at this and realize, oh, actually everyone else feels like this. And it gives people a bit more permission to talk about this stuff. I'm going to go on to the actual case studies now, if anybody's got any questions before I do.
Nope, nothing in the chat.
Okay. So the Valley Stories project was what we did in the South Wales Valleys. And we were asking the broad prompt question here was, if there was a new family move into your community, what story or advice would you tell them that shows what it's like to live here? So we were looking at how we could do kind of community profiling in a way that was culturally appropriate and actually also open data, so that the range of different community groups that got involved in collecting this data actually had access to the whole data set as well. So that became, that was kind of in our mind, but was never the big intention. But that came incredibly valuable in terms of supporting kind of funding bids and kind of representing community voice in a way that, you know, particularly when we had stretched and really understaffed community organizations who might not necessarily have skill sets or interests in this kind of stuff, that it became by, you know, by collecting 5 stories from your social network that you actually got access to, you know, a whole range of pre-analyzed data and some support in how to understand it and use it. So in doing that, we actually did it and brought the community together to look at the data that we collected, but in a pretty unique way, in that we used the trios idea, but amongst the stories we had a huge recognition of the tensions that existed between the younger population and the older population, only to be kind of mutually united by their mutual dislike of public services. So we actually put them in groups of 3 with a young person, an older person, and a member of a public service. and gave each of them a deck of cards with the stories that have been collected from their particular area. And in their groups of 3, they each took it in turn to read a story and decide whether in the future they'd like to see more stories like this happening in the local area or less stories like this happening in the local area. And it became a way to actually not only give people agency in the process of analysing and sorting the data and coming up with interventions, but actually a way of building in a degree of kind of coherence and a bit more trust and agreement amongst the 3 apparent warring parties, and in recognizing that as a group we've got assets and we can all agree that these are really great, and we've got a common recognition of the issues that are going on around here, and then looking at what were the small things that could be done in order to not necessarily solve the problems but to make them a bit more bearable. What were the kind of middle term visions in terms of how we might innovate to deal with these issues, and then what might blue sky thinking look like if we were 15 years ahead into the future. And as the result of those conversations, everybody in the room, so from the individual who's turned up just because they've seen there's a free buffet, right the way through to the kind of minister's representation, everybody's actually found some value in this data, this set of data, albeit they're taking different things from it. And again, then with the piece that we did in Sweden, we were looking at futures and strategy. So we worked with a group of around 40 young people who trained as community journalists. And they were asking the question, what is the biggest challenge or opportunity facing the future of the city? And these guys were absolutely incredible. So they managed to collect around 7,000 stories in 3 weeks. So, even as a quantitative researcher, that's a pretty decent data set. And as a qualitative researcher, that's mind-blowing. And actually, the only way we could have ever managed with that much data, because I would not want to be the person doing en vivo on that. So it was actually to allow the people who've told the stories to be the one that self-define them and self-codify them. And again, with this piece of data, we did a very similar approach, in that it became open access for the local civic societies kind of network. And again, the local government was using it for their long-term strategy and planning. So the idea about it being is that, if we're going to collect these types of data banks, how can we put the citizen in the center of all of this? In terms of them being the ones to define, what is the dialogue even about? What does it mean? And, to still have ownership and access to that data as well. Because actually the Swedish guys did a lot of work around not necessarily analytic use of the data, but as a means to kind of understand other people's experience of the city, and kind of some really humanistic stuff around it as well. And that it becomes, just a really nice cultural piece, if anything else. Richard.
Just thinking about my local community, I mean, whilst we generally get on well, there are definitely some axes of sort of tensions between. It's a very mixed community, but there are some major axes of tensions between the community as well. How do you manage, if you're surfacing that stuff, it could amplify those tensions rather than sort of diminish them? How do you deal with those sorts of issues?
Yeah, so we generally kind of, as I say, with the idea of, acknowledging that the tension is there in the first place is usually kind of the first step in dealing with it, and unpacking the why. So why is it that you see things like that and I see things like this? So in having surfaced that, it gives us something tangible to point at, and particularly in the Valley's circumstance, we use the stories as physical playing cards, because if people had disagreements, they were about the content of the story rather than disagreement with you as the local public service representative. So it's actually, how can we kind of use it a little bit as a proxy for reconciling those things? It's very relevant. And it's a great way of ensuring, particularly if you're holding community groups and you get in the same old people turning up, it's a way of getting representation in the room without those other people necessarily being there, because their stories are represented. So there's kind of an advocacy function to it as well in that sense.
And the other question, if I could sneak in another one, is how do you deal with apocryphal stories? I mean, I've used stories in my work in organizations, and very often you ask people to sort of tell you a story about their work, or something that went wrong or something like that, and everybody tells you the same story that's become part of the organizational sort of legends, if you like. I mean, can that distort? I mean, when you look at that story, it was a one-off that was, it did cause particular problems, but its frequency was, in terms of day-to-day, it was something that happened once in 3 years. How do you sort of deal with those situations?
Generally, we always frame it based upon something that's happened in your own life. So with the Sweden piece here, it was what was the biggest challenge or issue facing the future of the city. Please tell us a story about something that's happened recently that has shaped your opinion on this. So trying to make it about the individual rather than kind of these slightly more cultural or mythic stories that we quite often hold on to. I can see Lucy's got a hand up.
Yep, just fielding a question through from Charlotte. She's interested to know sort of the rationale behind calling the participants or community journalists instead of community researchers.
Yeah, so people have referred to them as citizen scientists, community researchers, story collectors. This is kind of a choice term. And I think largely the idea around calling people community journalists was around people having conceptions of research being something that is highly quantitative and is done to people. Whereas journalism for a lot of people felt a lot more like they were being interviewed, and it was around story. So it's kind of just a semantic thing. Personally, I more recently have moved away from citizen journalism altogether and just call people story collectors or listeners. And I'm recognizing that the time has just hit the top of the hour. I will send the link for the green spaces one, just because that's a really great one to look at in terms of beyond just the written text, that you can add photos and things like that. But on the slide deck, I would particularly kind of recommend people taking a look at the white paper, which is kind of a long read, but is probably going to answer just about all of your questions, and kind of the general invite for people to reach out or grab me on Twitter. And as I say, if anybody really wants to dig into the data analytics or talk about philosophy of data or data science, I'm happy to play. So thank you all for your time.